know who has access to what? This is the Identity at the Center podcast. If you're looking for identity and access management talk, you've come to the right place. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Jim. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I mean, considering it's a Monday and considering I'm at home, I'm looking around. I'm like, do I recognize this place? I haven't been here very much in the last month.
Yeah, what is this strange place? Yeah, 4 straight weeks on the road. That's a pretty good stretch for us.
It's a pretty good stretch for us, yeah.
It worked out.
And then on the road again next week, and then have a little bit of a reprieve.
Well, you do.
I do anyway. Yeah, you're going to be.
Next week should be fun, though. We have a company meeting, have something that we're trying to line up special for the podcast. I don't want to ruin it, so I'm not going to jinx it here. But if everything works out the way they're looking for, then we might have a pretty special episode, which would be pretty cool.
I think the thing that people who don't podcast probably don't realize is that when you say things need to work out, you're mostly talking about the recording being clean enough to even be worth listening to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the huge technical challenge is recording something, and then obviously as it's recording, you're not sure that it's going to sound decent until afterwards.
Right. Plus, there's always the things of content and stuff like that. I mean, I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to stuff like this, so I want to make a good showing of it. But yeah, the recording quality is always an issue and a challenge to address as best as you can. It's a little bit tougher sometimes depending on the environment they're at. So we're always looking for quiet spots when we're remote and traveling. But
yeah, if you have a lot of people joining either in person or even by phone, I mean, if their internet connection is not good. I was connecting from a hotel quite a bit last week, and my goodness, hotel Wi-Fi's are spotty.
Yeah, they're pretty terrible for the most part.
Yeah, it can be really bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine for email and stuff like that, but anything you do that requires bandwidth, high quality voice or, even video, certainly poses challenge. You get those dropouts and stuff like that. But
exactly.
Yeah, but I don't think anyone is really listening to us for our hot takes on hotel Wi-Fi quality or the lack thereof. What we want to talk about today is Gartner and their recently updated Identity Governance and Administration Magic Quadrant, the IGA MQ, something they put out every year, and like it or not, has become the starting and sometimes the ending point for organizations when it comes to shortlisting products in the IGA space. That being said, there are plenty of other products that are out there, and I don't think Jim or I would recommend that you only focus on the Gartner MQ, but it is a pretty good start as to where to look for specific products when you want to kind of get started and you're not sure where to go.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when we're working with clients, it feels like, okay, we could use the MQ. We usually do use the MQ as kind of a reference point, but anybody can read the MQ, right? So we have to provide value above and beyond that. But I mean, Gartner does a really good job of inventorying the space and kind of helping to define the population of what's out there and giving a decent overview of the products and how they fared over the past year, what their strategy is going forward. So it's a really valuable piece for somebody who's doing an evaluation. I mean, let's say most of our clients anyway are hoping just to do this evaluation one time, right? Really look at the space, choose a vendor to go forward with, and hope that vendor's around and in a commanding position 10 years into the future. But I think that the challenge is that most vendors don't maintain that pole position for that long. And so it's a challenge. I mean, you look at who the leaders in the space were 10 years ago, they're not leaders anymore. They're really falling off, like the Oracles and CAs. Now you still see IBM holding a pretty commanding position. That's kind of impressive. And I'd say they're the only big time legacy vendor who is still in the leader quadrant. But even for the most part, when you look at IBM, the solution that it has gotten them there into that leader quadrant today is not the product that they had 10 years ago. So, but I still think if you're aligned with the right vendor, you're going to be in a much better position going forward.
Yeah, and 10 years is a long time in IT speak. I mean, we've seen over the last couple of years vendors go from one quadrant to another to not even being rated. I guess let's touch on maybe some of the highlights that we've noticed as we kind of read through this. The first thing that I'll point out is that there are fewer vendors in the leader quadrant this year. We've got SailPoint, we've got IBM, as you mentioned, we've got One Identity, Savient, and Omada, which is a newcomer to the leader quadrant. They've been kind of hanging around in the challengers and the kind of the visionaries area, but they've pulled forward into the leaders quadrant. And we've seen, like you mentioned, a couple step back. Oracle and CA have taken pretty large steps back, actually, if you look at it. Oracle moved back into the challenge quadrant, basically kind of like right dead center of the graph. And CA has moved all the way back into the niche players. So there's definitely been a separation of traditional leaders and more separation now taking place even within the leaders quadrant.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at where SailPoint is, they're obviously, or I guess not obviously, but they have the pole position right now. They're the leaders in terms of ability to execute and completeness of vision, which is that's what the matrix is kind of based on when you look at the Magic Quadrant. And I'd say it's still their game to lose. Savient is a vendor that has made tremendous strides. So I mean, I'd say they're overall looking like the number 2 ranked vendor here within the quadrant. IBM has a higher completeness of vision, but I think what's interesting is what I keep seeing from Savient is they're pushing the boundaries into some of the other areas of IAM, such as privileged access management. So I think their completeness of vision is going to continue to grow. As you mentioned, Omada, it's kind of a vindication from my perspective in that we look at all these products and we get demos of all these products, and that's one of the great things about being in advisory services is that we get to see so much. And I think you and I identified Omada pretty early on as like, hey, this is a pretty damn good solution. The user experience is at the forefront. I think the investment they've made to integrate with the Microsoft platform and, to design around integration with Azure AD, that's their product differentiation. But, vindication from the standpoint that look at all these products, and I thought to myself, Omada is one that people need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, they're a European-based company that's definitely made a lot of strides to try and break more into the U.S. market. And I think that's why you've seen them jump up, kind of going up, right? That ability to execute, trying to get more partners, to be able to leverage professional services against them. But yeah, I think you and I both agree. It's been a couple of years now since I've seen Omada and continue to see their product, and every time it shows really well. Same thing for Savient. I always like what I see from them. I think they've grown quite a bit on their ability to deliver as well. They do a lot of changes and a lot of kind of like DevOps when it comes to their own products. So it'll be interesting to see how they continue to keep pace with that as they grow their customer base. But I think the one that continues to impress me is SailPoint. They've been in the leader quadrant, really the pole position of that leader quadrant for years now. What, 4 or 5 years at least?
Yeah, since like 15.
And that's tough to do, right? To stay ahead. You've got a lot of these different products. And I think Savient is starting to kind of nip at their heels a little bit, but that's good for customers because it drives innovation, and having competition in the marketplace is good. So, but I think that's impressive to kind of be up there for so long and to maintain that leadership is a good sign.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I think that was a good place to start, was kind of on the positive. One of the kind of on the negative side is, where's Microsoft?
Yeah.
Microsoft used to be listed here. They are not.
Yeah, they have fallen off completely. They do not have a true IGA product, I think, that meets the vision here. When they deprecated the Behold acquisition and the technologies there as part of MIM and so forth, I think that really hurt them. And they know that, though. I mean, they're working on getting Azure back up to speed. So I think they're taking a strategic step here where they know that on-premise type technologies that they have set up with MIM maybe aren't the future. And they're really trying to leverage Azure, and I think they're going to be poised for a pretty big comeback because they have such a large installed base already with Azure for people who are using Office 365. And as they get that component of their IGA component of Azure back up to speed and so feature complete, or not complete, but feature parity with MIM and moving forward and continue to add additional features, it wouldn't surprise me to see them back up into the leaders quadrant or close thereof over the next few years.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's the big thing with Microsoft is that they can move into this quadrant and move to the upper right very quickly. We did see some previews of their IGA capabilities at the Gartner IAM Summit last December. I'm hoping that to get a refresh view of that in this December, this coming December. I've kind of seen some things. I don't want to call it a MIM roadmap because I don't think that's really what Microsoft is calling it, but kind of a vision for where MIM is heading. And my takeaway from it was that I don't believe that Microsoft is going to um, heavily invest in MIM. They're not going to change the product set. They're looking at it more as like an on-premise provisioning and identity administration tool.
Mhm.
But their focus and their investment is going to be on Azure AD capabilities. The support for MIM Service Pack 2 goes all the way out to, I think it's like 2026. So you're going to be supported for quite a while if you build your infrastructure on MIM. And the reason I think that's important is that if you've kind of built your infrastructure on MIM and you're thinking about moving into this IGA space, you probably are the type of organization that wants to know where's Microsoft heading, right? You want to at least look at Microsoft's capabilities before writing them off. And not being on the Magic Quadrant, I think, hurts them from that perspective. But I think if I was in a customer position where I was replacing a MIM infrastructure, I'd want Microsoft to come in and kind of um, talk to me about where they're going with the Azure AD, IGA capabilities, and timeline roadmap. My feeling is that they're still going to be a couple years behind, the SailPoints and Sabians of the world, and Omada, and those guys also know they have to provide a tremendous value add on top of what Microsoft is bundling in the EMS package. Otherwise, why would anybody go out there and buy it, right? I mean, almost there, I should say, a large percentage of organizations are going out and having to buy at least some level of EMS if they're using Office 365 for email and for Office. So, um, why not kind of leverage a service that's kind of being thrown to them? Well, the reason to not leverage it would be if you have a lot of security features available in another package, say SailPoint, for example, that just makes it a compelling system that you need to move toward.
Yeah, I think the key part of what you mentioned there is the timeline, right? When are they going to be including these kind of standardized features now at this point that make IGA what it is? If it's going to be 2-3 years, can an organization wait that long? You're right. Maybe they're trying to address something from a compliance perspective or a more immediate need, and they may not be able to wait. I think it's a kind of a interesting track to follow because we saw something similar in the access management space with Microsoft being not really kind of considered a player, and now they've moved up into the leaders quadrant there after a couple of years of investment on their Azure access management side. So I have a feeling we'll see the same on the IGA side. I just wonder when it will take place and if organizations can wait that long. One thing to consider would be there is strategic guidance from Gartner, and I think this is something that we've seen as well, is that you want a clean system going into any sort of IGA implementation. So, I think this is an opportunity for vendors that have a very good access certification process that layers on top of what's already out there. Might be a way for some of these products to kind of make an inroads against, MIM and things like that, where it's like, hey, let's get SailPoint or Savient or Amada and help us out with some access reviews and access certifications to make sure the access is appropriate. And that's sort of a door that gets opened up. Say, okay, hey, you know what, we can do these other things. And then you start to look at, well, does it make sense to continue using MIM? Or do we shift over to, one of the newer products out there in that IGA space and just leverage technology that we're already using for the certification side of things?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Hey, Jeff, so a couple other just things that I've noticed in terms of vendors who are missing Avexa and core security. I mean, Avexa used to be right there neck and neck with SailPoint in terms of kind of 1 and 2 in the IGA space.
Mm-hmm.
Core security, formerly Quadrant, I mean, they've been in the identity, let's say prior to the IGA quadrant, I think it was called IAG quadrant. So this is going back, probably a decade. These guys have been one of the main players. I know at least in one of the quadrants they were upper right. Now they had some divestiture and M&A that took place, and anyway, they're not even covered at this point. So I found that kind of interesting.
Yeah, Corian is where I cut my teeth. That was the first IGA, well, probably IAG at that point, implementation that I went through, bringing it into, a couple of organizations actually, but they have certainly kind of fallen off from here. I haven't really seen as much of a focus on the IGA component. Now, they're doing some other things around security and, alerting and events and stuff like that. So, as you mentioned, they went through different, acquisitions and mergers and divestitures and stuff like that. So I think they're still kind of working through that process. But
yeah,
a little sad to see my first one fall off the table, but that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Stay up with it.
Well, my first 2 were Oracle and CA, and they're working their way out. So, but yeah, I mean, I think what it is that it just goes to show you, if you don't pick a vendor that is going to be on here, you may wind up stuck with something that you need to get off of quickly. And so what can you actually do about that? I think the only thing you can do is, one of your evaluation criteria has to be, how forward looking is this company, right? Are they just kind of, doing kind of me too and follow the leader, or are they the leader? Are they the ones who are pushing the boundary? I've noticed that out of SailPoint is that they were coming out with like a risk engine and integrating identity analytics into the access request and access certification process. They were doing that before I really saw anyone else kind of going after that. And that tells me that they want to be leaders in the space. And, that kind of stuff is, I'd say like a risky investment for a vendor, because they're trying to roll out functionality before the market may be demanding it, before there is a fully mature market for it. But it puts them in the position of, being the first mover. And I think that that's indicative of them being a thought leader and somebody who will be around and in the leaders in a leadership position for years to come.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, what happens if you pick something, let's say you pick a product that is not a leader, right? What is the risk of it falling off completely and not being able to meet strategic needs down the road? Or what is the projected path of it moving forward? I think Savient would be a good example of that, where, they weren't a leader for a few years, kind of a newer product, but their path has been up versus these other paths like Oracle and CA and Microsoft and Core, who have continued to trend down and even off in some cases. It's an interesting thing because a lot of times these products are very sticky, and you end up getting something and you hope it's great and you hope it's there for 10 years or longer, but that may not be the case. Things change, et cetera. And a lot of times that's that's a definer when it comes to a program success or not. If the technology is continuing to keep pace with the program needs for the organization. So what do you do when when you've got a product that is good now, but let's say in 5 years isn't, meeting your needs anymore? Making that shift out of a product is sometimes a nuclear option. And I think a lot of people kind of recognize that, and they end up sticking with something longer, hoping it makes a rebound. Or at some point, they kind of bite the bullet and decide, okay, now it's time to make a change. And then another vendor kind of swoops in and, tries to take the business.
Right. And I think a lot of times that decision comes down to like how quickly a company will move on that is how happy they were with the solution. So if they had it rolled out, they're very happy, then it's like, well, they're still alive, they're still offering support, and we're happy.
Yeah.
But if you were never that happy with it in the first place, then it kind of expedites the decision.
Yeah.
Just as you were talking, though, I was thinking of a couple of things. So you mentioned Savient. They started outside the leader quadrant. They've been in the leader quadrant for a while, and when they were outside the leader quadrant, they were up and coming, and they were the company that was going to be there. And let's be honest, they were probably a lot less expensive. I mean, once you get that pole position in the leader quadrant, you put yourself in a position where you command a premium price. And whether you're looking at IGA or access management, we hear that from clients a lot, is that, well, they don't put it in these terms, but when they talk about the vendors who are in these leadership positions, is that their solutions are very expensive. And so when you have very expensive solutions, I think, obviously you're paying for the success that has already been there and projected future success. But if you can get in on one of these non-leaders who are going to move in to the leadership position, then I think you can lock in a better price. So Jeff, I'm going to challenge you and say, look at the quadrant, and who do you think, if you were a betting man, you can't pick SailPoint. If you're a betting man, who's going to move the furthest to the right and up, and who would be the vendor that you think is going to maybe the dark horse?
A dark horse. So obviously not SailPoint. Can we consider SailPoint? Is Savient a dark horse at this point? Because I think they continue to grow, but I like what I'm seeing from them.
I think you could look at Savient as a dark horse. I mean, it's a safe bet. I'm not going to give you too much credit for that, but honestly, I was going to go with Omada just because I like what I've seen, and I think that there's still quite a distance between Omada and SailPoint. And I'm not saying they're going to catch them, but I think Omada gives you the opportunity to kind of still get in early.
Mm-hmm. I think obviously they have a visibility problem. I don't think people really know about Omada. I think they're trying to make strides again in the U.S. market, but when you mention Omada to someone, everyone's familiar with SailPoint. People are starting to become familiar with Savient and other kind of legacy big vendors, but no one really knows, in the U.S. at least, what Omada is and what it does. I think that's the challenge that they face: is can they get into more people's faces and at least get into the demo kind of cycle of a company, right? Most companies are going to take a look at 1, 2, maybe 3 products and then kind of go from there. If they're able to make that short list, I think they're going to have a much better time. I do like what I see from them. But I think so you put me on the spot, and I remember I put you on a spot several episodes ago, and you gave me a cheesy answer. So I'm going to give you a cheesy answer right back. I think you're going to continue to see SailPoint and Savient stretch leads. And I think you're going to see just further differentiation between SailPoint, Savient, and maybe Omada and IBM. I think IBM will be an interesting one because I don't think people truly kind of look at them as, hey, we're going to put something brand new in. And they have a lot of different products that kind of cobble together to create their IGA solution. So I think they'll just kind of continue to hang around, very similar to kind of like what Oracle has done for years, where they have a lot of features, but it may be a little more difficult to implement. But my cheese answer will be that I think you just continue to see the separation of SailPoint and Savient, and I think maybe some other ones will kind of come up a little bit forward, and you'll see the bottom left start to move even further down and away.
Is there anyone on the quadrant anyone missing from the quadrant that you think next quadrant or a couple quadrants out is making some noise?
I mean, there's always blockchain. We don't see a blockchain vendor on here. Probably too soon for that. I mean, I think there's some other ones that have gotten some honorable mentions, things that we've seen in the past, like Tubora, things like that. I don't know if there's anything that's truly kind of jumped out yet. I think maybe when we get to Gartner, maybe we'll see some new products there if they have, a booth. But I think it takes a lot to break into this quadrant. These are well-established organizations, right? They're adding, I think that like the minimum inclusion is you have to add 50 new customers net new in a year. So that precludes a lot of smaller vendors who are just kind of starting out.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned Tubora. I think that's a really cool solution, but I think by the time they get to 50 new customers a year, it's going to be a couple years down the road. Obviously I mentioned Microsoft. I think Microsoft will be in the leader quadrant within 2 years. That's my crystal ball answer, but I already seen kind of the the show and tell last year where they had some identity governance. They've already got the identity, so they're doing password management. It's just kind of taking that next step into having a good access request workflow. I mean, look, it's not simple. I'm making it sound simple,
Right.
but they've got the resources to really attack this. The other one that I see, making strides into user management, user provision, user lifecycle management is even what they call it, is Okta.
Yeah.
They want to be in this space, and I think again, customer base, they've got their hands on a lot of identities, and now it's just kind of taking that next shift. I think the thing for Omada to really move up and to the right is exactly what you said in terms of exposure visibility, but it's also they've got to show that they have value add over what Microsoft throws in with EMS, which I already think they're way ahead in those terms, but I think that has to continue to be the positioning because there's such a Microsoft focus. Their partnership with Microsoft is kind of the focus of their solution. So they either would have to change the messaging of that to become more of a heterogeneous play, like I think SailPoint and Savient are, or they're going to have to say, look, Microsoft gets you so far, that's not far enough. We get you the rest of the way.
Yeah, when you just talk about Microsoft and Okta, I think it's really interesting because they are both focused on cloud-based solution, cloud-based provisioning. And as organizations shift away from those on-premise applications, right, I think that becomes kind of the doorway to having more cloud provisioning. So I don't see, in the short term, Okta being able to do an on-premise SAP integration as well as, the leaders right now that are out there.
Right.
But once if they have start moving away from cloud mainframes, into cloud-based solutions, those sorts of things, I think that really is going to be the kind of the door to let cloud IGA really kind of take off.
Yeah, and I think that there's probably going to be a shift in the provisioning space. I mean, again, crystal ball here is when I remember the web access management space 10 years ago, the big focus was what agents do you have? So do you have a Lotus Domino agent, a Java server agent, an IS agent, all these things that you could integrate your web apps back to the mothership. And then along come Okta, Ping, and all the web SSO providers, and they're saying integrate with SAML. And now it's integrate with OpenID Connect. And so it's a shift toward open standards. And, I can see provisioning moving toward open standards too. I mean, a lot of the connectors you're going to find with even SailPoint, Savient, and the other top vendors are going to be RDBMS connectors, so relational database, or a flat file connector, an LDAP connector. But then they'll also have SAP connector, like Oracle Apps connector, an Epic connector in healthcare. I don't see Okta really moving in that proprietary connector space, but more saying we have open source connector. If you want to use our system to provision, again, this is crystal ball. This isn't, I don't have a vision to the company strategy here, but if I was the integration approach I would favor would be a REST connector, relational database, LDAP, have kind of open standard based connectors or well established standards, not proprietary connectors for applications, which limits you somewhat. But again, I think what happens is that kind of puts the onus back on the applications to come halfway and meet you halfway, and that's really what happened with SAML. I mean, I remember in my early days in access management, it was like we wanted all these connectors because we didn't want the have to force the applications to change. And what happened with SAML and organizations standing up single sign-on systems is that they said this is what we support, and you need to change your application to integrate if you don't currently support SAML. And a lot of there are a lot of solutions out there that help them SAML enable their applications. But it wasn't just that you guys don't have to change. We're going to give you an easy button to integrate with our solution. It was, this is our standard, and you're going to have to find a way to you're going to have to change your application.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. What drives inclusion of standards into applications? If I'm building a new app today, I want to build it on standards, OAuth, SAML, SCIM, right? Those types of things, and make my app very extensible, have APIs, not just have APIs, but have, well-documented APIs. And I think that's something that sets Okta apart from a lot of different vendors is they have a really good developer portal, right? Where there's a lot of documentation, and a lot of stuff that is done with them is API driven and can be API driven. So I think that's important from an application standpoint as you start to look at the IGA vendors. At what point does it matter for custom connectors or client server connectors, things like Epic and the ones that you mentioned? Are people going to care? Does it make sense to buy a product that is still looking at kind of legacy connections? And if it, who cares? Focus on the other things, work on things that are standards based, and the things that are not standards based, you figure out whether or not it makes sense to include as part of IGA or not.
Exactly. One of the last things that I wanted to talk about was within this report, Gartner kind of kicked it off by saying, different strategic planning assumptions, and that there's a big focus on analytics and machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think that what that means is the ability for applications to do predictive analysis in terms of, all right, you have these entitlements on this user already, based on what other people have, you may also want to request this. So it's kind of like, when you go to Amazon and it's kind of trying to steer your path toward what you might really need to simplify the identity provisioning process. I think also, in terms of access certifications, being doing micro certifications. So most of the organizations that we come into contact with are doing access certifications on an annual basis or a quarterly basis, and they're much more static. But I think there's a shift, and we've been talking about it for a long time. Like, this is great functionality if you can have it, which is, hey, based on an event, I just locked out my password and unlocked it. Let's do a recertification based on that, just for that one user, just to make sure that they didn't get walked out yesterday and now they're locking out their password and resetting it or something like that. And the third thing that I think vendors will start incorporating, we've already seen it, I mentioned it earlier on SailPoint side, is evaluating risk. What is the risk of that a user possesses? You can use that for certification or access request processes. And what is the risk of the entitlements that they are attempting to be provisioned to? And so using risk as an element to drive workflows for reviews and recertification. I think that's kind of the next big thing when it comes to identity governance. Because what do we keep hearing at clients? It's like rubber stamping because of the overload associated with too many approvals, too much data coming their way.
Right.
So how can you reduce the amount of things that they need to process? Well, it's by sending them less, sending them fewer things to read, fewer things to approve. And the way to do that is by sending them the high risk things, and maybe the low risk things you don't recertify as much or ever. Maybe you don't even really need to have an approval. If the risk is so low, why bother a manager with having to approve it and potentially creating a fatigue associated with having too much to approve?
Yeah, I agree with all that. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that is probably a good spot where we can leave it for this show. Where do you get this report? I think the best answer for that, because I don't want to promote any specific vendor, would be just visit any of the leaders, and I'm sure they'll have it plastered on their front page, right? In exchange of an email address, I'm sure they'll be happy to give you a link for it. You can also get it from Gartner directly, if you've got a Gartner subscription, or if you want to purchase the report specifically. But I got mine from one of the leaders. I won't say which one, in exchange for my email address, and here we are.
And Jeff, the report was called the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Identity Governance and Administration.
Ooh,
it was published on October 9th of 2019. Apparently,
yes.
It's a 64-minute read.
Yeah, I would say that. They cover each of the vendors, kind of cover strengths and weaknesses on each, and kind of where they're at in the market. That sounds about right.
I just think it's very interesting on how they come up with 64 minutes. It must be some algorithm,
machine learning,
based on the machine learning. Exactly.
Everything is machine learning now. Most people are just going to pick it up, look at the quadrant, say okay, and then pick out the vendors that they care about, and then read those sections. I read the whole thing. I mean, there's obviously a lot of other vendors that are out there that are worth the time consideration, because this quadrant does focus more on mid and large size businesses. So if you're a little bit smaller, or maybe smaller mid, it may be a better fit out there. So I would encourage folks to do their due diligence. Take this with as a data point, but not necessarily make it your sole data point for making a decision. All right.
That's good advice, Jeff.
Let's call it for this week. And thank you all for listening. If you've got questions, feel free to email questions@identityatthecenter.com. If you're looking for show notes, we typically will put them at the bottom of the podcast description. Each of the different services handles a little bit differently, so it's tough to say where they'll be. But if you visit identityatthecenter.com, that'll have a list of all the different shows, and underneath each of those will be the show notes, so you can always find them there as well. All right. Take care, all. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. To access all episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.